What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video we're going to be going over the latest results from the most recent Critter tournament, the ETC7. Now, I think these results are super exciting and could have major ramifications for the metagame going forward, so I'm excited to dive into them with y'all. But before we do that, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. I'm about to dive into a brand new format, MRL format, which should be a lot of fun. So if you want to follow that and see what this new format has to offer, definitely stay subscribed so you can keep up to date on my videos. In addition, we now have a Discord server. The link will be in the description below, but it's a really cool place. We just get together and we can play games in these very underexplored formats, and it's been a blast so far. So if that's something that interests you, please be sure to check that out as well. And of course, if you enjoy this video as always, please leave a like below. But with all that out of the way, let's dive into the results of this tournament. So I'm not going to reveal what decks were in the top cut just yet. First, I want to talk about the deck type representation. Now, of course, just like in pretty much every Critter tournament, the top deck was Mass Control. 9 people came with a Mass Control build, and there's not really much to say about this deck. It's one of the most iconic decks in this format, and it's one of the best decks in this format. It's proven again and again that it has consistently been able to show results, and it is very, very strong. Now, there are tons of different ways to play this deck and build this deck, so I'm sure there was a ton of variation in this Mass Control category. But at the end of the day, no matter what the variation, Mass Control decks are going to be pretty powerful. Now, the real surprise in the decks coming to this tournament is in the second highest represented deck, which is Muka Muka Turbo. Now, to be fair, there's only 5 people on this deck, and this was a very small tournament, so it's unclear whether this will really scale up to larger tournaments. But Muka Muka Turbo is a deck type that really emerged in the last Critter tournament, and I think has really caught on and is pretty popular. I've sort of looked down on this deck in the past as being just like an engine for a different type of deck, but the people on Muka Muka Turbo in this tournament really showed me that this deck can just do well on its own. It doesn't need extra fluff, and they actually did pretty well, and they were the second highest represented deck category. So this could potentially be a new tier 1 deck. Of course, time will tell whether this is just a passing fad or if this deck actually deserves to be at the top. But I think it would be a welcome addition to tier 1. Right now, the 2 tier 1 decks in this format are Mass Control and Exodia, one of which is a control deck, the other of which is a stall deck, both of which are very slow. For a long time, people have been theorizing about a sort of aggressive beatdown deck that could rise up to take like the 3rd slot in that tier 1 category, but nothing has ever really materialized around it. Muka Muka Turbo, however, can potentially be that more aggressive deck. It still isn't a pedal to the metal, Jirai Gumo Dark Elf beatdown deck or anything like that, but it is a bit more aggressive, and I think it's really cool, and taking advantage of Muka Muka, which is a card that a lot of people have been coming around to in recent months. So excited to see that this was so well represented, and excited to see that it actually made Top Cut, which we'll get to in a little bit. Of course, before we get to Top Cut, there are some other important decks that we need to cover, like Exodia. 3 people entered the tournament with Exodia, not as many as in the past potentially, but Exodia is a deck that's always going to be around, and it's always going to potentially be able to win you games. People have learned to play around it more and more and be prepared more and more for this deck. But, even with preparation, the deck can still win, especially when in the hands of a skilled player. So this is a deck that's not going to go away from these tournaments anytime soon, and a deck that you always need to watch out for. Moving on from the more popular decks, we also have some decks that only 1 player were on. So there was 1 Vanilla Beatdown player, 1 Catapult OTK player, and 1 Stall Mill player. These are decks that I also think will always be around, as they are somewhat popular, although in the case of Stall Mill, I don't know how popular that really is. But, I think their representation in this tournament shows that they just aren't quite there yet in terms of being able to make a dent on the metagame. And as I mentioned, Muka Muka Turbo might take the place of a more aggressive deck like Catapult OTK and Vanilla Beatdown in the future. So, interesting to see that there were only 1 player on each of these. Good to see that they were at least represented. But I think it makes sense that not many people were on these decks, despite how popular some of them have been in the past. The deck category representation doesn't really yield too much interesting info once we've gone over the deck type representation, but one thing I do want to note is that it's marked that there are 14 control players, which is presumably the Mass Control and Muka Muka Turbo players, which I think is a good thing to note that, I've been saying Muka Muka Turbo is more aggressive, but it also very much still is a control deck at heart. And I think Critter format is largely just a control format. Exodia is kind of the outlier as it's kind of stall combo, but besides that and some tier 2 and rogue decks that get a bit more aggressive, I think control generally just wins the day. There's so many powerful control tools that were released in Metal Raiders that, control decks really thrive in this format. So just wanted to point that out before diving in to the top cut decks themselves, which were really interesting. For the top 4 decks, Mass Control won the tournament in the end, but there were actually 2 Muka Muka Turbo decks, Ghost Rider 15's Muka Muka Turbo deck and Paolo NS's Muka Muka Turbo deck. And, I will say, to get into Top Cut, you had to have a score of 4-1, so you won 4 games and lost 1 game in Swiss. And there was one other player with a 4-1 record who didn't make Top Cut, and that player was me. And I was also playing a sort of Muka Muka Turbo deck, just with a polymerization in there to turn it into a fusion deck as well. So in the top 5 players, there were 3 Muka Muka Turbo lists, and this is out of a total of 5 Muka Muka Turbo players who showed up total. So that is very good representation in the top cut of this tournament. And I think that's a real good sign for Muka Muka Turbo's relevancy going forward. And I think that this deck is going to be experimented with a lot more and could potentially see a tournament win in the future, not just a tournament top. But I think that these decks are very cool. You'll notice that they go in some different directions. For instance, Paolo NS's list is on Robin Goblin and Swords Revealing Light, and some of those cards. Ghost Rider 15 has shaved those out for 3 Solemn Judgments, and has cut down on a Last Will as well, and also has even cut down on 1 copy of Muka Muka, whereas Paolo NS has 3 Muka Muka but has cut down on 1 copy of Mass Sorcerer. Now you might wonder, given both of these decks playing multiple Mass Sorcerers, why they're not counted as Mass Control. And I do think that the line between Muka Muka Turbo and Mass Control is a bit blurry at times. You'll notice that Jazz's winning Mass Control list here actually has 2 Muka Mukas in it, and it's playing 2 Last Wills. So you could maybe classify that as a Muka Muka Turbo deck as well. But I think the big difference between them is that the Muka Muka Turbo lists are playing 3 copies of Thunder Dragon to boost up the hand and make Muka Mukas even beefier. And I think that's probably a good signifier that a list is Muka Muka Turbo versus Mass Control. Because if you're playing the Thunder Dragons, you're basically stating that your mission purpose is to beef up Muka Muka. Because Thunder Dragon doesn't really serve much purpose outside of that. I mean, it does thin down your deck a little bit. And in the instance of my Muka Muka Turbo deck, which could go into Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, it can serve as a late-game finisher. But, overall, it's not really worth it for the average deck to play, in my opinion. Different people have different takes on this. Some people value the deck thinning enough to play it, even if they don't really have cards that can take advantage of it. Some people use it as discard fodder for things like Magic Jammer or Tribute to the Doomed. But, I mean, in general, I think if you're not playing something like Muka Mukas or things like Exodia with Last Will, then the deck probably isn't going to be worth it in a standard Mass Control list. So I like that sort of distinction between Muka Muka Turbo and Mass Control. If you want to see my Muka Muka Turbo list as well, it is basically the fusion list that I showed off in a past video. I just made some slight changes to fit into Heavy Storms. I believe I cut 1 Giant Soldier of Stone and cut 1 Last Will as well. I was actually on less Last Will this tournament because I figured that people might be on less Trap Holes, as I know that Last Will has become a more and more popular choice in a lot of decks. So I actually cut Trap Hole from my list entirely, and you'll notice that the winning list also cut down on a Trap Hole, dropping it down to 2 copies instead of 3. I think that this will be an interesting trend to see in the future, especially with Muka Muka Turbo doing so well, if people start just dropping Trap Holes entirely to make the Last Wills basically dead in hand. I don't know, something to consider and something to see going forward. But I've talked a lot about Mass Control Muka Muka Turbo in this top 4 deck list. You'll also notice that Exodia actually made it and got 2nd place, which is a pretty good showing for Exodia. I think it shows that even if people are prepared for Exodia, that sometimes isn't enough to stop it. And I feel like in every Critter tournament, there's always going to be at least one Exodia deck in the top cut, as it is a very good deck, and people will always be playing it. But I don't think the list itself is that interesting to talk about. It's basically the same as many other Exodia lists in the past. The interesting list that I want to talk about is Jazz's Mass Control list, as I think that this does a lot of innovative things here. So right off the bat, something that you notice is one Karibo in the main deck, and I actually think this is a really cool inclusion in this deck. It's so searchable off of Witches and Sangans, and your opponent doesn't really have a way to deal with it, right? Like, there isn't much hand removal in this format that can preemptively hit a Karibo outside of battle damage. The only thing I can think of is card destruction, which has been more popular in recent times in the main deck, but in this tournament clearly fell out of favor. And so there aren't really many ways to deal with a Karibo searched off of a Witch or Sangan after your opponent tries to do some big OTK push. And just being able to search that Karibo, mess up their math, and potentially just really punish them for overcommitting to the field on the next turn just really makes Karibo a very powerful inclusion in the main deck, I think. And it'll be interesting to see if more decks adopt this going forward. Also, you'll notice one copy of Jirai Gumo in the main deck as well. This is a great search off of Witch if you need to go a bit more aggressive and potentially make a major push late game. It can also be very useful at dealing with opponents' Mukamukas, as oftentimes your opponent is only going to have a Mukamuka up to 2100 with 5 cards in hand, and Jirai Gumo can beat over that, where something like a Lodge-In would not be able to. I think the rest of the monster lineup is pretty standard. Of course, 3 Lodge-In, 1 Giant Soldier Stone to act as a searchable defender if you need it, a Cannon Soldier, 2 Magician of Faith, 2 Mass Sorcerer, 2 Mukamuka, the Recruiters, of course, and a White Magical Hat for things like Exodia. The spell lineup is similarly more standard. The Power 5 limited spells, of course. We've got 2 Heavy Storm, only 2 Fisher, which is interesting, but I think it makes sense here, as you've got the Mukamukas, you've got the Jirai Gumos, you can get over your opponent's monsters. So Fisher isn't really as necessary when you're trying to beat over your opponent's stuff. So I think it makes sense to potentially cut 1 for space. In addition, the 2 heavies are here, of course, 2 Last Wills, and 2 Swords of Revealing Light. All very, very standard stuff for the most part. For the traps, it's also pretty standard. A Mirror Force, 3 Solemn Judgment, and 3 Uboku, and 2 Trap Holes. And I mentioned earlier that I think that this is a smart inclusion in the main deck, cutting down on a Trap Hole, as, it just triggers your opponent's Lost Wills sometimes. And if you draw it too late and your opponent's already stuck monsters on board, then it's not really as good. So I'm curious to see if more people will start cutting down on Trap Holes in the future. The side deck is also pretty standard, it seems like. 2 Giant Soldier Stone to get more defensive. An additional copy of Karibo, which I like as a choice. If you're playing against a more OTK style deck, then I think having the extra copy could be nice. An additional Mukamuka and 3 Thunder Dragons to back it up. I think that's a good inclusion as well. It enables you to turn the deck into Mukamuka Turbo very, very easily if you want to. 2 card destructions against Exodia, it looks like. The 3rd Fisher, the 3rd Trap Hole, and some Robin Goblins and Fake Traps if you want to get a bit more discard heavy. All in all, I think this is a really tight list, really well optimized, with a veritable toolbox of monsters for any situation that you can search out with the Witches and Sangans. And a list like this just really shows the power of Mass Control and how good it can be when a good player is behind it. But that's going to do it for my coverage of this tournament. I thought it was a lot of fun, even though it was a much smaller tournament than the Creepy Critter Extravaganza was. It was really, really fun to play. Really, really cool to see everyone's decks. And just awesome to sort of see the meta change in real time. But what do you all think is going to result from this tournament? Do you think that Mukamuka Turbo is just a flash in the pan and just made it to Top Cut because there were much less players? Or do you think that Mukamuka Turbo is indeed a new Tier 1 deck and will potentially win a tournament in the future? Let me know down in the comments below. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.